Hey everybody, it's Mr. Stafford, and today I want to talk to you a little bit more in depth about the colonies, the various countries that are colonizing North America, and the various differences within the English colonies. So, first of all, four groups that are really battling for control of North America. I put on this list France, Spain, England, and then the various Native American groups. And our European settlers are primarily motivated by economic and religious gain. Native Americans, obviously, on the defensive, trying to protect themselves from what they would consider various foreign invaders. All right, so let's talk about some of the first English colonies in America. I'm just going to run through this list really quick. We're looking basically at their motives, challenges that they faced, and whether they ultimately were successful or not. So let's start with Jamestown in 1607, motivated by potential profit. This is the Virginia Company, hoping to find gold like the Spanish had in South America. They did not. They were not very resourceful, not very experienced colonists. They suffered great challenges, the starving time, cannibalism, very, very difficult challenges, but ultimately they were successful, but only after a long period of suffering and death. And ultimately in Virginia, it's going to be cash crops like tobacco that are going to be their gold. Plymouth, 1620. This is a colony that is settled by separatists. So be sure you watch the Puritanism lecture so you know what separatists are. They are challenged by the poor soil of New England, rocky soil. It's not good for farming, but they are successful largely because they're pretty prolific. They bring their families and they care for each other like a community, and they figure it out and develop various economic means that do not rely on healthy soil and massive cash crop production. All right, let's move just a little bit over from there to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was founded in 1629. These are non-separatist Puritans, unlike the Pilgrims, who are seeking greater religious freedom. They don't want to separate from the Anglican Church, but they would like to purify it from its Catholic vestiges. So they have a tough time with farming and there's tough conditions and weather, but ultimately they are successful as well. Much like the Pilgrims, church and family are the center of their community. They're going to rely on things like timber and fishing and ultimately later shipbuilding and trade with the Atlantic world. If we move further south, we're going to look at the southern colonies. We're going to jump over Virginia because we've already talked about Jamestown and Virginia. The southern colonies between 1663 and 1733 were settled by colonists who were, again, motivated by economics, wealth. They wanted to replicate the success of the Indies with sugar plantations. They ran into disease. They found the cultivation of sugar was very difficult, but they ultimately found success in crops like rice. And later, much later, cotton would be the main cash crop of this region. All right, what about the French and the Spanish? So ultimately, the English are going to prevail in North America, and for the most part, and the French and the Spanish are ultimately going to be sent back to Europe at various times throughout American history. So it doesn't all happen in this colonial period. But the English colonists were settled permanently. They came and had more at stake and more resources to build their population. They had women, they had families in some parts. The French and the Spanish never really seemed to develop an American identity in North America like the Spanish had in South and Central America. They wanted to come and get the fur and the gold and send the wealth back home and then eventually head back home. So the French ultimately will get their exit ticket from North America, or most of what would become the United States of America, part of North America, in the French and Indian War. And the Spanish are going to kind of go back and forth on territories and ultimately will lose to the United States and to revolution, the Mexican Revolution. The Dutch. So the Dutch are going to establish a colony in what is today New Jersey, New York, Manhattan. Was kind of the hub of the Dutch colony, and it was all about trade. And eventually, I think by the early 1700s, they'll lose control of their colony. So they aren't really in it for the long haul like the Spanish and the French were. All right, what about Native Americans? So a wide variety of Native American groups occupy North American territories, various cultures and languages. They're spread out, they're decentralized, so it's hard for them to put up an organized fight against the European colonists. This is ultimately going to hurt them because they've been battling each other for a lot of years. So after about 100 years of war with Native American groups, ultimately they're going to be pushed further and further west, and ultimately we'll see their demise in the 19th century. Disease and lack of organization really hurt their chances. The French are going to interact with Native Americans in a very different way than the Spanish and the English. The English and the Spanish are going to be fairly in line with their attempts to kind of conquer the Native Americans. The French, interestingly, are going to be able to find a middle ground, and they're going to work with the Native Americans. So the Native Americans are very sad to see the French get kicked out of North America and replaced by the English, who are going to be far more brutal in their foreign policy with the Native Americans. Okay, so you should be thinking in terms of colonial regions, New England, middle colonies, southern colonies, and within the southern colonies, you can divide the Chesapeake region from what would become the Deep South. And what you need to be able to do, and there's a lot of resources to help you do this, is compare these regions and their development. How did they develop economically, politically, socially? What motivated people to move to these particular regions? Because this is going to help us to understand the character of the United States and how it will develop regionally as we move through the 18th, 19th, and into the 20th century. A lot of the vestiges of these early colonial differences you can still recognize today in American history. You should also be thinking about the differences between the Spanish colonies and the English colonies and the French colonies and the Dutch colonies. Right? We're talking about comparisons, similarities, and differences as a way of helping us to understand how the United States and its people will develop an identity in relation to each other and in relation to the rest of the world. Okay, that's it for colonial comparison for today.